Picture a country the size of Germany, with a population smaller than modern-day London. In the winter of 1939, this country was attacked by the largest army on Earth, and it fought that army to a standstill. That war made Finland famous. It's called the Winter War.
But here's what almost nobody talks about. 18 months later, Finland went to war with the Soviet Union again. This time, it fought alongside Adolf Hitler. This time, it lasted 3 years, not 3 months. This time, Finnish troops crossed the old border and occupied Soviet territory. And this time, when the guns finally fell silent, Finland was the only continental European country bordering the USSR that ended the war not occupied by a foreign power, not turned communist, and not erased from the map.
This is the story of the Continuation War. The conflict historians and textbooks skip past, caught awkwardly between the heroism of the Winter War and the moral catastrophe of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. It's a war where the same Finnish soldiers who were celebrated as underdog heroes in 1939 became, in the eyes of much of the world, Hitler's accomplices in 1941. It's a war of revenge, survival, opportunism, and one of the most remarkable diplomatic escapes of the 20th century. Let's talk about the war nobody remembers, and why Finland's choices in it still shape how the country sees itself today. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. Stalin expected a quick victory. Some Soviet planners reportedly assumed the war would be over in under 2 weeks. Instead, Finnish forces, fighting on skis, in white camouflage, using the brutal cold and dense forests to their advantage, inflicted staggering losses on the invading Red Army. The Battle of Suomussalmi alone saw 2 Soviet divisions effectively destroyed. But numbers eventually mattered more than tactics. The Soviet Union kept feeding men and material into the fight, and by March 1940, Finland was exhausted. No meaningful help had arrived from the Western Allies. Britain and France debated sending an expeditionary force, but logistics, politics, and Norwegian and Swedish refusal to allow troops through their territory made that impossible in time. Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty in March 1940. The terms were harsh. Finland ceded about 11% of its territory, including nearly the entire Karelian Isthmus and the city of Viipuri, Finland's second largest city at the time. Some 400,000 Finnish Karelians, roughly 12% of the country's population, became refugees overnight, forced to abandon homes their families had lived in for generations. This is the psychological starting point for the Continuation War. Finland hadn't just lost a war. It had lost land, lost homes, and lost a sense of security that would never fully return. The peace was viewed by most Finns not as a resolution, but as an intermission, a pause before Stalin would inevitably finish what he'd started. Finnish leadership operated under the assumption that the Soviet Union would attack again once it had reorganized its military, and they were determined not to be caught off guard. This fear wasn't paranoia. Soviet actions in the following year did little to reassure Helsinki. The USSR pressured Finland over nickel mining rights near Petsamo. It demanded transit rights and continued to make Finland feel like a country living on borrowed time. When Nazi Germany, recently victorious over France and looking for allies against a future war with the USSR, began quietly approaching Finland about military cooperation,
Finnish leadership found itself facing an uncomfortable, but to them, logical choice.
Finland did not become an ally of Nazi Germany in the way Italy or Romania did. Finland never signed the Tripartite Pact. Finland maintained a democratic government throughout the war, held elections, kept a free press by wartime standards, and, crucially, refused to hand over its Jewish citizens to the Nazis, a fact that stunned German officials who raised the subject. Finland's small Jewish population, numbering under 2,000, largely survived the war, serving in the Finnish military alongside their Christian countrymen, an almost unique situation among Germany's wartime partners. Finnish officials called it a separate war, waged not as Hitler's ally, but as what one could call a co-belligerent, a country fighting the same enemy at the same time for entirely different reasons. Was this a meaningful moral distinction or a convenient fiction? The case for separate war, Finland's aims were narrowly defined around recovering the territory lost in 1940, plus, for some nationalists, achieving a long-dreamed-of Greater Finland that would include Finnic-speaking populations in Soviet Karelia. Finland did not participate in the broader ideological war against communism in the way Germany did. It did not send troops to fight far from its own borders, did not join the assault on Leningrad's inner defenses directly, and maintained separate command structures from the Wehrmacht throughout.
The case against it. Finland allowed German troops to stage from Finnish territory. Finnish forces did advance well beyond the pre-Winter War border, occupying large stretches of Soviet Karelia, territory that had never been Finnish in modern times, and established a military occupation administration there. Finnish forces participated in the siege of Leningrad by holding positions north of the city, contributing, even if passively, to a blockade that killed over 1 million Soviet civilians through starvation. Truth is probably that both framings are partially correct, and that's exactly what makes the continuation war such a fascinating and uncomfortable subject. Finland was a democracy, allied by circumstance with a genocidal dictatorship, fighting for what its people saw as legitimate self-defense and national restoration, while simultaneously participating in and benefiting from one of history's greatest atrocities. There's no clean way to resolve that tension, and Finland itself has spent decades in domestic debate over how to remember this period. On June 22nd, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Finland did not immediately join. For a few tense days, Finnish officials maintained a stance of neutrality, even as German bombers used Finnish airfields to strike Soviet targets, and German troops massed in Finnish Lapland for their own northern offensive. The Soviet Union made the decision easy. On June 25, 1941, Soviet aircraft bombed several Finnish cities, likely targeting German assets on Finnish soil, but the effect was to give Finland's government the pretext, and, in the eyes of most Finns, the genuine justification, to declare that Finland was once again at war with the USSR. Finland framed this as defensive. They had been attacked, again, without provocation. The offensive that followed moved with startling speed compared to the grinding defensive war of 1939-40. This time, Finnish forces were attacking, not defending, and Soviet forces in the region were badly weakened, their best units and commanders having been purged by Stalin in the late 1930s, were transferred to face the German onslaught further south. By September 1941, Finnish troops had not only recovered all territory lost in the Winter War, but pushed further, capturing Viipuri and advancing deep into Soviet Karelia. Finnish forces took the city of Petrozavodsk, capital of the Karelo-Finnish Soviet Socialist Republic, by October. In the north, Finnish and German troops operating jointly pushed toward Murmansk and the vital Kirov Railway, though this offensive would eventually stall in the subarctic terrain. By December 1941, the front lines had largely stabilized. Finland had achieved most of its territorial objectives. And then, for nearly 3 years, something strange happened. The fighting almost stopped. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of the entire war. For roughly 2.5 years, from December 1941 to June 1944, the front between Finland and the Soviet Union barely moved. While the rest of the Eastern Front consumed itself in the largest and bloodiest campaigns in human history, Stalingrad, Kursk, the endless meat grinder between Moscow and Berlin, the Finnish front settled into something resembling the trench deadlock of the First World War. Mannerheim, notably, refused repeated German requests to join a direct assault on Leningrad itself, choosing instead to hold a static defensive line north of the city. Finnish forces did participate in the siege by controlling territory that helped isolate Leningrad from the north, but Mannerheim drew a line, literally, at attacking the city's defenses directly. Life on this frozen, static front took on an almost surreal quality. Soldiers on both sides, having exhausted the initial fury of the invasion, settled into routines of trench maintenance, hunting, sauna building. Finnish troops famously built saunas even in forward positions, and periods of unofficial live-and-let-live behavior, similar to what's been documented on quiet sectors of the Western Front in World War I. Finnish troops famously built saunas, even in forward positions, and periods of unofficial live-and-let-live behavior, similar to what's been documented on quiet sectors of the Western Front in World War I. Meanwhile, back home, Finnish society continued functioning. Schools stayed open, elections were held, and the government maintained a level of civil normalcy almost unimaginable in occupied Europe or within the Soviet Union itself. Meanwhile, back home, Finnish society continued functioning. Schools stayed open, elections were held, and the government maintained a level of civil normalcy almost unimaginable in occupied Europe or within the Soviet Union itself. Behind Finnish lines, however, occupied East Karelia told a much darker story. Finnish military administration ran internment camps for the ethnic Russian population of the occupied territories, as distinct from the Finnic-speaking Karelians, who were treated preferentially. Tens of thousands of ethnic Russian civilians were held in these camps, and conditions were poor enough that thousands died, particularly in the harsh winter of 1941-42, from malnutrition and disease. This is a part of the continuation war that Finnish national memory has historically underemphasized, and one that modern Finnish historians have worked to bring into fuller public view. It complicates any narrative that frames Finland's war purely as noble self-defense. While the front line held steady, the broader war was turning decisively against Germany. Stalingrad fell to Soviet counteroffensive in early 1943. Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, ended in German defeat that summer. By 1943, it was becoming clear to Finnish leadership, and increasingly to the Finnish public, that hitching the country's fate to Germany's had been, at best, a bet that was no longer paying off. Finnish diplomats began quietly probing for an exit as early as 1943, testing whether the Soviet Union or the Western Allies might offer terms that would let Finland leave the war without being occupied or absorbed into the Soviet sphere. These early efforts went nowhere. Soviet terms in 1944 demanded steep territorial concessions and the internment of German troops still present in Finland, conditions the Finnish government wasn't yet willing to accept. On June 9th, 1944, just 3 days after the Allied landings at Normandy, the Soviet Union launched a massive offensive against Finland on the Karelian Isthmus. This was not the under-resourced, poorly led Red Army of 1939. This was the war machine that had crushed the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad and Kursk, now turning its full industrial and numerical might on a much smaller opponent. The initial Soviet assault was overwhelming. Finnish defensive lines that had held for 2.5 years began to crack within days. Viipuri, recaptured by Finland in 1941, fell back to Soviet hands by June 20th. For a moment, it looked as though Finland might face total collapse and full. What followed was the largest battle in Nordic history, and one of the most consequential battles almost nobody outside Finland has ever heard of. The Battle of Tali-Ihantala. Fought from late June into July 1944 near the Karelian town of Tali, this battle saw Finland throw everything it had into stopping the Soviet advance before it could break through to Helsinki itself. Finnish forces, reinforced with German assault guns and air support, Germany reluctantly provided in exchange for renewed Finnish political commitments, fought a desperate, grinding defensive battle across a compact stretch of forest and leak terrain. Artillery concentrations reached staggering densities for the size of the forces involved. Finnish gunners, short on other resources, made devastatingly effective use of concentrated fire tactics developed by Finnish artillery officers. Finnish gunners, short on other resources, made devastatingly effective use of concentrated fire tactics. Artillery concentrations reached staggering densities for the size of the forces involved. By mid-July, the Soviet offensive had stalled. Finland had held. It hadn't recovered all the ground lost in the initial Soviet breakthrough, but it had stopped the collapse. And crucially, it had proven, again, just as in 1939, that invading Finland would cost more than Soviet planners wanted to pay for a secondary front, while the main prize, Berlin, still lay ahead. With the Soviet offensive halted, Finland's political leadership moved fast. President Risto Ryti, who had personally guaranteed Hitler that Finland would not make a separate peace, resigned in August 1944, a resignation widely understood to be a calculated legal maneuver. Since the personal guarantee had been Riti's alone, his departure freed his successor to negotiate independently. That successor was Mannerheim himself, now stepping from military command into the presidency. Finland signed an armistice with the Soviet Union on September 19th, 1944. The terms were severe, but survivable.
Finland ceded additional territory beyond the 1940 losses, including the region around Petsamo, with its valuable nickel mines. It agreed to pay substantial war reparations to the USSR, a burden that would weigh on the Finnish economy for years. And critically, it agreed to expel all German forces from Finnish territory, by force, if necessary.
This last condition triggered one final bitter chapter of the war, the Lapland War. German forces stationed in northern Finland, some 200,000 troops under the command of General Lothar Rendulic, did not leave quietly. What followed, from September 1944 into April 1945, was a strange and often reluctant campaign in which Finnish troops, recently allied with these very German units, now had to force their withdrawal. Both sides initially tried to manage this transition with minimal bloodshed. There are accounts of German and Finnish units essentially coordinating logistics for an orderly German withdrawal in the war's early weeks, since many soldiers on both sides had fought alongside each other for years and had no appetite for turning their guns on former comrades. But Soviet pressure and the letter of the armistice required Finland to demonstrate real hostilities, and skirmishing escalated into genuine combat, particularly around the town of Tornio. As German forces retreated northward into Lapland, they adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying infrastructure, bridges, and entire towns as they withdrew. Most infamously, the Germans burned the town of Rovaniemi almost completely to the ground. This left a bitter legacy. The very allies Finland had fought alongside for 3 years left behind devastated Finnish towns as a parting gift. By April 1945, the last German forces had been pushed out of Finnish territory into occupied Norway, and the continuation war in all its phases was finally, fully over. Finland entered the continuation war chronically short of modern weaponry, having spent the interwar period underfunded and the winter war burning through what little it had. Germany became the primary supplier of tanks, aircraft, and artillery. But Finnish forces also famously fought with an enormous grab bag of captured Soviet equipment, so much so that entire Finnish... Tactically, Finland leaned heavily into lessons learned from the Winter War, the Motti tactic, surrounding and cutting off larger road-bound Soviet columns in the forest and destroying them piecemeal, had been devastatingly effective in 1939-40, and Finnish commanders tried to apply similar principles during the 1941 offensive phase, particularly in the more forested central and northern sectors. Finnish CC units, light infantry trained for long-range reconnaissance and raiding deep behind Soviet lines, became legendary for operations that ranged for weeks through Soviet-held territory, cutting rail lines and gathering intelligence far from any friendly support. These units drew on a tradition of ski-mounted, self-sufficient winter warfare that Finland had essentially perfected out of necessity. These units Finns drew on a tradition of ski-mounted, self-sufficient winter warfare that Finland had essentially perfected out of necessity, given the brutal terrain and the impossibility of matching Soviet numbers in a conventional stand-up fight. In the air, the Finnish Air Force, flying a patchwork of Brewster Buffalo fighters, considered mediocre and often outclassed in American and British service, but flown with remarkable skill and success by Finnish pilots against Soviet opposition, along with German-supplied Messerschmitts later in the war, produced some of the highest kill ratio fighter aces of the entire Second World War. Ilmari Juutilainen, Finland's top-scoring ace, is credited with over 90 aerial victories without ever being shot down himself, a statistic that stands among the most remarkable in the history of aerial combat.
And then there's Mannerheim himself, worth a closer look, because he's one of the more fascinating and contradictory figures to emerge from the entire war. Born into Finland's Swedish-speaking aristocracy, he had spent decades as a cavalry officer in the Imperial Russian Army, serving in the Russo-Japanese War and along the Eastern Front of the First World War, before returning to a newly independent Finland and leading the conservative white forces to victory in the brutal Finnish Civil War of 1918. By the time the Continuation War began, he was already in his 70s, an aging aristocrat who had fought for the Tsar, then against Finnish communists, and was now navigating an alliance of convenience with Hitler while trying to keep his country's democracy intact. His famous personal restraint, refusing to shell Leningrad, refusing to let Finnish artillery target civilian areas of the city, even when German commanders pushed for it, has been cited by many historians as one of the reasons Finland retained a degree of international sympathy that fully committed Axis states never did. Here is the fact that makes Finland's Continuation War genuinely remarkable in the context of the wider Second World War. Finland is the only continental European country that fought against the Soviet Union and did not end the war either occupied by Soviet forces or transformed into a Soviet satellite state. Compare Finland's outcome to that of its neighbors and fellow Axis co-belligerents. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were annexed outright into the USSR. Poland, despite fighting against Germany, ended up under Soviet domination for the next 4.5 decades. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria became Soviet satellite states with communist governments installed under Moscow's supervision. Even East Germany was carved off into a Soviet-aligned state that would exist for 45 years. Finland alone kept its parliamentary democracy, its market economy, and its independence. War reparations to the Soviet Union, paid mostly in industrial goods and ships, consumed a significant share of Finland's GDP through the early 1950s, though this forced industrialization arguably helped modernize the Finnish economy in the long run. Finland lost roughly 97,000 soldiers dead across both the Winter War and Continuation War combined, a staggering toll for a nation of under 4 million people. Finland lost roughly 97,000 soldiers dead across both the Winter War and Continuation War combined, a staggering toll for a nation of under 4 million people. Karelia, ceded a second time, remained permanently Soviet, and over 400,000 displaced Karelians had to be permanently resettled within Finland's shrunken borders, a resettlement program considered one of the more successful post-war refugee integrations in European history. Politically, Finland accepted a position that came to be known, somewhat critically, as Finlandization, a foreign policy of careful neutrality and non-alignment specifically calibrated to avoid provoking Soviet intervention. Finland stayed out of NATO for the entire Cold War, avoided overtly antagonizing Moscow in its press and diplomacy, and generally kept its head down on the international stage. Critics, particularly in the West, saw this as a humiliating compromise of sovereignty. Finns, by and large, saw it as the price of the very independence that so many of their neighbors had lost outright.
So why does almost nobody talk about the Continuation War? Partly, it's an uncomfortable story for everyone. For the Allies, popular memory of WW2, it complicates the tidy narrative of good versus evil. Finland was a democracy fighting alongside the Nazis, but not like the Nazis, and that nuance doesn't fit neatly into documentary runtimes. For Cold War-era Western audiences, Finland's careful post-war neutrality made it an awkward subject. Not quite a free Western ally, not quite a Soviet satellite. And for a long time, even within Finland itself, the more uncomfortable aspects of the war, the East Karelian internment camps, the moral compromises of co-belligerency with Hitler, were quietly under-examined in national memory, only receiving fuller historical scrutiny in recent decades. It's worth noting how much this legacy shaped Finnish policy for decades afterward. Finland didn't join NATO until 2023, a decision directly triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, breaking 8 decades of careful non-alignment rooted precisely in the lessons of this war. But that discomfort is exactly why the story deserves to be told. The Continuation War isn't a simple underdog story like the Winter War. It's a war full of contradictions, a democracy allied with a dictatorship, a war of national survival that was also a war of occupation, a defeat that somehow preserved everything a nation valued most. It's a reminder that the Second World War wasn't fought only in the grand, familiar theaters of Normandy, Stalingrad, and Iwo Jima. It was also fought in the frozen forests of Karelia, by a small nation trying, against enormous odds, to simply remain itself.
Finland went to war twice against a superpower and lost both times on paper, and somehow won the only thing that actually mattered. It kept its independence. That's a story worth remembering.